Support provided by Walters, Papillon, Thomas Cullins, LLC, specializing in business litigation and personal injury cases for over 40 years.
So when Mick and I were partners at Jones Walker, our offices were down the hall from each other, and he'd pass by my office on the way to the kitchen, and he'd look in and he'd say, "Bud." And so I'd go the long way down the hall by his office, and I'd stick my head in and I'd say, "Bud." So that became our trademark. And the day that my last day in the office, he left me a handwritten note, and he addressed it Bud. And Mick, that note is on my desk at the Department of Revenue, because we really are buds. So, the title of my presentation is Fiscal Cliff Notes from the Secretary. So, since most of the people in the room will recall using Cliff Notes when they were in school, I talk about Cliff Notes to people under a certain age, and they don't know what that is because all they know about is Google. Google doesn't tell them, they don't know what it is. But for those of us of a certain age, and I'm only 29, so that's my story, I'm sticking to it. Cliff Notes were the way to go if you didn't manage to get that book read that you were supposed to get read. So this is the Cliff Notes version of the Fiscal Cliff. And I want to start with how we got here. And what we've done is a 10-year comparison. Then and now is what we like to call it. Fiscal year 2008 compared to fiscal year 18. And in 2008, we were talking about a $10.4 billion general fund. Fiscal year 18, we're talking about a $9.4 billion general fund. Now that's $1 billion difference. And all we've heard about is how much state government has grown in this time. Now when we talk about the entire budget, we're talking about more than just the general fund, but the general fund is what actually comes into state government, what you pay in taxes, what comes in fees, and self-generated revenue. Those things. Also what comes in from oil revenues, gaming proceeds, lottery proceeds, those things. Those are the general fund revenues. What makes up the total budget includes federal dollars that come in and other flow-throughs of dollars. Also those things that we sometimes refer to as double counts because they're interagency transfers. As an example, my agency has dollars appropriated to it that I use to pay the Division of Administration for the use of services from the Office of Telecommunication Services. That's our phone system. I also pay the legislative auditor to come in and audit me. Now that is something I'd rather not pay for because I'm never happy about the legislative auditor's audit. But nonetheless, I have to pay the legislative auditor. So that's funding that is appropriated to me that I then pay to another state agency. So even though it's counted within the total budget, it's not really new revenue, it's still within the same revenue. So when we look at that total general fund budget, it's broken down between the general appropriations, but also the judiciary, the legislative, and then the capital outlay budget. And we're not even talking about the transportation trust fund. And this is Infrastructure Week. I don't know if Sean Wilson has been here to speak to you, but he's our Secretary of Transportation. If you haven't heard from Sean, please invite him to speak. He does a great job of explaining our infrastructure system, and this is Infrastructure Week. We have a $13 billion backlog of infrastructure, so this discussion on general fund and the fiscal cliff does not begin to address that $13 billion backlog of infrastructure. So as we talk about the cliff and needing to address that, know that there are more important cliffs and bridges and roads that we do have to address separate and apart from the fiscal cliff within our general fund budget. So what are the components of state revenue? We have two big pieces of our state revenue. The sales tax, which back in 2008 made up close to 30%, and income tax made up close to 30%. This chart compares 1981-82, which was back our oil peak year. That was just before the bottom fell out of the oil market. Back then, the biggest piece of our revenue pot, and I think I remember how to use, that's not the right button. Haggai ran away. Supposed to know how to point with this thing. I give up. The star. The biggest part of our budget then was actually from oil revenue. Well, we've modernized. Now, when you look at our budget, it's sales and it's the personal income tax. We no longer rely on oil revenue to fund state government. We learned our lesson then. All right, we're going to get some help when he comes back. Uh-oh. Technology impaired. That, perfect. I didn't do it. It wasn't me. So when we compare the source of funds, back in 1982, 64% of our budget came from the state general fund. Now, we're looking at 40% of our budget coming from the federal government. Most of our money is coming through as match dollars from the federal government, and most of that comes through the Department of Health, Medicaid match dollars. Only 28% of our budget comes from the general fund. Things have changed significantly in the last 35 years. Things have even changed pretty significantly from 2008, just in terms of just that significant switch when you look at general fund dollars. That $1 billion difference is fairly significant in terms of percentage, but our federal dollars are pretty consistent, still 40%. The $30 billion in general fund and total budget, that's what we're talking about. Those federal dollars, that 40% is coming from the feds. It's not state general fund. It is the additional flow through of dollars that are coming into the state that make up our budget. State general fund, interagency transfers, as I talked about. That number down at the bottom, 13.2, is the federal funds. That is the money that we bring back to the state through the Department of Health and through the Department of Transportation to fund infrastructure. Now, some of that, when you exclude double counts, like the interagency transfers that I mentioned, the total budget is 29.5, so right at $30 billion. That's the budget passed by the legislature for the current fiscal year that we're in. Now, I was going to put a slide in on the budget that was passed by the Senate yesterday that went back to the House for concurrence today, but the headlines on that budget are not positive, and I see Richard Lipsey shaking his head. That budget has been called lots of things. It's been called a play budget, it's been called a temporary budget, a starting point, but no matter what you call the budget, it is short the revenue to fund all of the expenditures that at least most people in the legislature and the agencies and people that depend on state services have agreed are necessary to fund. Those things that are on that slide, where do we spend your general fund dollars? Healthcare, higher education, K through 12 education, public safety and corrections, debt service, general government, the legislative and judiciary branches, children and family services. You will see the largest piece of that pie is K through 12 education. And that's in the Constitution. We don't get to choose whether we fund K through 12 education. It is constitutionally mandated and it is 39% of the general fund dollars automatically. The Department of Health is somewhat mandatory in that if you have a Medicaid program, the federal government has certain parts of it that you are mandated to provide. You don't get to decide if you provide general Medicaid access to health care. Now, there are optional services that you choose if you provide. Children's dental services, access to hospice care. Now, if you are someone who is sick and you've been told that you need hospice care, I don't think you believe that that should be an optional service. But under the Medicaid program, hospice care is an optional service. Dialysis is an optional service. We talk about now waivers, the opportunity to have home-based care if you have a disability. Those are optional services under Medicaid. So those are the parts that, while they seem cruel, that those are the parts of the Medicaid program that are often up for discussion to be cut. Those are the things that the federal Medicaid programs say are optional. Richard is very familiar with higher education and the fact that it is $1 billion of the general fund. Right now, the budget cuts at least $90 million from higher education. That seems like a small amount of money, but that's 10% of their budget. And after having cuts to higher education over the last 9 years that are crippling cuts to higher education, and we have the distinct honor of having the largest disinvestment in higher education in the country over that same time period, another $90 million cut does not provide higher education with the necessary resources to continue to operate. So when we talk about where the state general fund dollars are spent, a $90 million cut to higher education is very difficult. So the budget as passed on yesterday, while it is a balanced budget, it is not the budget the Senate is necessarily proud of, which is why there was an accompanying resolution talking about the revenue options to be considered in the special session. It was also not the budget introduced by the governor that he was interested in introducing, because it did reflect a shortfall in revenue that did not fund all of the services that we normally fund with the general fund dollars. And this slide just goes into where those general fund dollars are spent on average over the last 6 fiscal years, just to give you a sense of actual state tax dollar spending. And you will see the very far right is, again, K through 12 education. That is the largest portion of where our dollars go. Children and Family Services, which supports our foster program, as well as the SNAP benefits, supplemental nutritional assistance, that is the smallest portion of where our state tax dollars go. And I see a former secretary of the Department of Children and Family Services turning around to smile. She's very familiar with that agency, but that's the smallest portion of where our dollars go. Debt service, full faith and credit of the state behind the debt that the state issues. Constitutional mandate that we pay our debt first. That comes out of the top also. State tax dollars go to that first as well. And so when we talk about discretionary and non-discretionary spending, you will see at this point in next year's budget, 51% of the general fund dollars, we have no discretion over spending it. It goes to the MFP, elections, debt service, local support to pay supplemental pay for law enforcement, the revenue sharing agreements that are in the Constitution for local government. These are things that are constitutionally mandated. When you pay those things up front, you only have a little under 50% of the budget that you have any discretion over where to spend it. And those big pieces are higher education and health care that are left. And when you consider that Medicaid, if you're going to have a program, you have to spend a certain amount on the mandatory Medicaid, then you have less than 49% that you truly have discretion over. And this just outlines the things that I was outlining before. The Constitution mandates, MFP, and debt service, things that are due to court order, debt service, federal mandates such as Medicaid, our statutory obligations to fund DA salary supplements, housing, local offenders, legislative and judiciary budgets, and then certain things that we can't avoid, which includes group benefits for retirees, health care for adult offenders. If we incarcerate inmates, we do have to provide health care. The federal courts mandate that. So those are costs that we really can't avoid. So while they're not necessarily in the Constitution, those are obligations that we can't avoid paying for. So that takes even more discretion away from us in terms of what we can spend money on. So that brings us to the fiscal cliff. What do we do now that we're here? And I say now that we're here because today's May 16th, and $1.4 billion of revenue goes away June 30th. And that's revenue that was passed in 2015 and 2016. $8.6 billion in major revenue, primarily from the sales tax. In 2016, we added a fifth penny to our existing state sales tax. That fifth penny generates $880 million of additional revenue. That fifth penny expires June 30th. So I'm standing on the cliff and I'm looking over. I'm feeling very Thelma and Louise-like. Trying not to press the accelerator, trying real hard. But that goes away. We also decided in 2016 that we were going to suspend certain exemptions from the sales tax. Now, I'll tell you a little secret. There are 186 exemptions from the state sales tax. They're both constitutional and statutory exemptions. We decided in 2016 that we were going to do away with some of those exemptions. Not that many. There's still, even with doing away with some of those exemptions in 2016, there's still a good 130 that apply to the sales tax. But we did away with some of the things. We tried to do away with more of them, but there were some things that were not very popular that we were doing away with. Some things are too complicated. And I'm not going to say that these things were not necessarily too complicated, but nonprofits, and I'm not picking on anybody who's from a nonprofit in the room. Don't look at me in that tone. Nonprofits who hold events. You all hold casino nights. You hold, and I'm a sustainer in the Junior League. We hold holidays. We cannot collect sales tax on our admission charges. That was too complicated. Now, as a member of the Junior League, I know how well we run holidays. Collecting sales tax on those admission tickets was not going to be that complicated for us. And I see some fellow leaguers shaking their heads. But in general, sales tax on admission tickets was going to be too complicated, so we had to change that. We went back to exempting those admission tickets. And you heard how many degrees I have from LSU. Sales tax on LSU football tickets, that was a bridge too far. Even to get over the cliff, it was a bridge too far. So, again, some things we couldn't address. So there are still a number of exemptions, but we attempted to get rid of some of those exemptions. That is a part of the $1.4 billion in revenue that goes away. Back in 2015, we gave some haircuts to some of the credits and rebate programs. We have a myriad of credits and rebates that we offer. Some of them are programs that are used frequently. Some of them are rarely used, but we gave them 20% haircuts and 25% and 28% haircuts. Those are also sunsetting on June 30th. So all combined, the estimate of revenue that goes away June 30th is $1.4 billion, or 1.38, so we're rounding to 1.4. When that revenue goes away, we have to address how we replace it. When you look at the impact in our major revenue sources, corporate, individual, sales, mineral, and gaming, that reflects a drop of $8.6 to $7.6 billion. That's the cliff that we've been talking about. Not that the state is planning to spend more money next year than we spent this year, that our revenue projection for next year is less than our revenue projection for this year. The proposed expenditures are staying at the same level, but revenue will not be the same. And we've been very careful, at least, and I say we, the Edwards administration has been very careful. We've stuck to what the Revenue Estimating Conference has forecast. We've not said we're planning to replace the $1.4 billion in revenue that goes away. We've only sought to replace the difference in the Revenue Estimating Conference forecast. So back in February, we had our first special session of this year. When we started the February special session, we talked about a $994 million revenue estimate that needed to be replaced. That was based on the December 2017 REC forecast, difference between FY18 and FY19. That was before the federal reform package passed at the federal level. With the passage of federal tax reform, Louisiana will have additional revenue coming in from the personal income tax. That is the result of our existing constitutional structure. Now, I spoke to a group a few weeks ago, and I told that group, next year, when you file your Louisiana individual income tax return, do not blame me if you owe more money to the state. That is a result of Louisiana being one of only 3 states that allows you to fully deduct your federal income taxes paid. 100% of what you pay in federal income taxes, you get a deduction for on your Louisiana tax return. If you pay less federal income taxes, your deduction in Louisiana is smaller. It's in the Constitution. When that deduction goes down, the amount of Louisiana income taxes you pay will naturally go up. So we changed the withholding tables so that we can lessen the sticker shock for some people, but you still may be in a position next year of writing a check to the Department of Revenue. I thank you in advance, but I also tell you in advance, I did nothing. Federal tax reform and the way that our system is structured. Now, there was a task force that worked through 2016, and they recommended that we do away with that federal income tax deduction because it does subject us to whatever changes happen at the federal level. We are a state that completely piggybacks the federal tax system. It's one thing to piggyback the system, that makes ease of compliance a great thing. But when the federal tax decreases and your state tax increases, well, then you're left in the position of saying, well, that's not fair. But when you give a full deduction, you have that impact. When your federal taxes increase, we at the state are saying, well, wait, we're going to lose revenue, and we can't afford to lose revenue right now just because the federal government has decided to raise revenue. We're stuck in a catch-22. So the recommendation of the Task Force on Structural Reform was that we decouple from that federal income tax deduction. But that is something that the legislature has not decided to put before the voters as it relates to individual income tax. If we do away with that as part of long-term structural reform, then we won't be subject to federal tax changes in the same way, having an impact on us. But another part of federal tax reform that will have an impact is the increased standard deduction, which will also have the effect of lowering your federal tax burden. And the differences to the itemized deductions, that $10,000 cap on state and local taxes paid will also reduce, for those people that itemize, it'll reduce your itemized deductions, which will have an impact on your state taxes as well. So just remember, next year, I'm not to blame. But the result of that is the Revenue Estimating Conference gave us an improved forecast for next year. So now our difference is down to $648 million. So the special session that is scheduled to start next Tuesday at 4:00 p.m., we're looking to address $648 million in revenue to replace. That doesn't mean that expenditures have changed, but the revenue that we are looking to replace is estimated to be $648 million. That call for the second special, convening Tuesday at 4:00. While it is a long call, for those of you that have taken the time to look at it, it's 3 pages long when you print it out. My apologies. The first 12 items really deal with budget matters. House Bill 1 in its current form, assuming it passes the legislature, we know that additional revenue will have to be added. So we're dealing with being able to add that additional revenue. We're also looking at the capital outlay budget, bills that are pending for statutory dedications and fees. Those first 12 items in the call primarily deal with budget issues, being able to appropriate the necessary additional revenue in the event that we are able to raise the $648 million that need to be raised. The other call items deal with raising that revenue. Item 13 deals with the income tax brackets. The Stelly plan. Now, I know in some circles, Stelly plan is a bad word. Brief history. 2002, voters approved a swap. Put in the Constitution exemptions from sales tax for food, utilities, prescription drugs, increase the income tax by compressing the middle bracket and doing away with the excess itemized deduction. Everything was working great under Stelly. It was working exactly the way we wanted until that first income tax bill came and people had to write a check. And then they weren't so happy with Stelly. If you look at this chart, you see the sales tax change, the blue lines at the bottom. Sales tax dollars went away. Red lines at the top, income tax dollars came in. That's the way Stelly was supposed to work. It was an offset. 2007, we're in a post-Katrina year. We have additional income as a result of federal dollars coming in. Oil is at $120 a barrel. People don't like the fact that they've had to pay more income tax. They're still complaining. And the legislature decides they can start undoing the income tax pieces of Stelly. So in 2007, they undid the itemized deduction piece. In 2008, they undid the brackets. And you see the blue lines going down at the bottom. The individual changes went away. And now we're 700 to 800 million short on the personal income tax as a result of Stelly going away. Interestingly enough, 700 to 800 million short is about where we are on the forecast. Call items 14, 15, 16 deal with the temporary reductions that we talked about from 2015. Call item 14 talks about expanding the sales tax to services, some of the services that are taxable in Texas, such things as repairs to immovable property, sales tax on cable television, sales tax on security services. The only thing that anyone has agreed with me on services over the last 2 years is to tax Turkish baths and massage parlors. That's it. That's all I've got agreement on. I don't know who owns these Turkish baths, but I do know they don't have lobbyists. That's the only thing I've got any agreement on. Items 18 and 19 deal with the fifth penny and the exemptions that we did away with in 2016, that we got rid of some of those. Items 20 through 29, again, credits, rebates, tax credits for ad valorem taxes, and then our tax expenditures and incentives, which are part of the resolution that the Senate introduced on yesterday that deal with how do we address our incentives, expenditures, and are we spending more money on tax incentives than we can afford to spend in the state? And should we put caps in place on some of those programs? Those are the other call items. I give you kind of an estimate on tax exemptions because everyone talks about how many tax exemptions when we talk about incentives. We have about 469 different programs, and the revenue loss from all of the programs is right at $7 billion, but this is everything. This includes the federal income tax deduction I talked about. This includes all the sales tax exemptions, including the ones that are in the Constitution. This includes things like the S-corp exclusion, which really isn't necessarily an exemption. It's just allowing S-corps to pay at the individual level. All of that is included in that tax exemption budget number. These are things that people talk about when you hear about that $7 billion in exemptions. It's not all total exemptions, but that's where that number comes from. This document is available on the Department of Revenue's website if anyone wants to do some nighttime reading. 30 through 31, the Deepwater Horizon Damages Fund is $53 million the state collects for the next 19 years. These are recovery of dollars the state spent, not damage dollars for damages to the actual wetlands or the coast. The expenditure limit, do we need to lower it? And then the expenditure reporting is Louisiana checkbook, if that bill needs to be reintroduced in the special session. Has to adjourn no later than June 4th. That is the plan. That's also the date the regular session was set to end so that we don't incur any additional expense for holding this second special session.
Support provided by Walters, Papillon, Thomas Cullens, LLC, specializing in business litigation and personal injury cases for over 40 years.